welcome to the third public lecture of the Knowledge with Impact lecture series hosted by the Faculty of Education and Health Sciences. It's really great to have you all here. Thanks a million to Lynn and to Sinead for organising this event. So my name is Elaine Kinsella and I'm the Assistant Dean for Research in the Faculty. And the purpose of these public lectures is to highlight the excellent research occurring around our faculty, particularly the research relating to our key research themes, so optimising health, professional and practice and education, physical activity and human performance, and social inclusion. So today's session will be recorded, so please keep your microphones on mute. And at the end of the presentation, you can use the raise your hand function or the chat function to ask questions during the Q&A. So our speaker today is our colleague, Professor Mike Quayle. Mike is a social psychologist here at the University of Limerick. Mike started his university education at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, from undergraduate through to PhD. He then took up a junior lecturer post at the same university and worked his way up to senior lecturer. And in 2015, he made a big decision to move to Ireland, and specifically the University of Limerick, as a lecturer below the bar, and continued to climb the ranks again. Mike continues to hold an honorary post at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. His research explores identity and how active identity production impacts on psychological experiences and outcomes. Mike is the holder of 3 highly prestigious European Research Council or ERC grants. Most recently in 2023, he was awarded almost €2 million to investigate social polarization through the ERC Consolidator grant. Mike works in very collaborative and interdisciplinary ways, and since his arrival at UL has built really strong collaborations in the Department of Psychology, the Mathematics Applications Consortium for Science and Industry, also known as MAXI, LERO, Centre for Social Issues Research, and beyond. In Mike's teams, you will find social psychologists, mathematicians, statisticians, physicists, and computer scientists. Mike is not only a very successful researcher, he's also a really great colleague, and he's really generous with his time, discussing research ideas, reading through other people's grant proposals, and so on. And he remains incredibly humble despite all of his successes. So I'm really looking forward to today's talk, which is entitled Threads of Identity, How Attitudes Weave Us Together or Hold Us Apart. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Elaine. Can I just check how much time do I have before we shift to questions?
What would you like? It's up to you, really. So 20 to 30 minutes, I suppose.
Okay.
You can go for longer if you want. We've got an hour slot.
Okay, so maybe 35 to 40. I'll try and go quickly, but there's a lot to discuss. And thanks for the great introduction, Elaine. If for the few people who were here right at the beginning, you would have overheard me say that a lot of this work is on the backs of my colleagues. So I'm kind of a conductor in an orchestra, just waving my hands around and not doing very much at all. And all these fantastic people in my group are really doing the hard work, and I couldn't have done any of this without them. So really I'm reporting the product of a large collaborative project, and we're only just getting going, I think. It's work that I'm very excited about, but I am a tiny bit kind of anxious about presenting this work in this seminar series, which is titled Knowledge with Impact. And I am not entirely convinced that what I'm going to present can be thought of as facts. I think it is knowledge, but I think these models and theoretical frameworks that we're developing should be thought of more like analogies or metaphors to help us think about social systems. I don't think any one description of something as complex as society can be treated as the answer, the correct way of thinking of it. So of course we have empirical evidence. We've backed up our ideas with research. It seems to be working very well. But I wouldn't argue that this is the only way to think about opinion dynamic systems. And I think there are lots of different ways of describing the information in a system as complex as this. And I'm also a tiny bit worried about making an impact, because what this work has taught me more than anything else, I think, is how complex society is. And in my discipline, especially social psychology, we spend a lot of our energy trying to simplify these complex systems down to really almost trivial causal dynamics. A causes B, and we believe that once we have a causal description, we'll be able to sort of somehow control that system. And I'm not convinced that we know enough yet to be confident that if we intervene, that we'll be able to predict what the outcomes are. So just hold that in mind as we get through this and to the end, that hopefully this description is useful. Hopefully it helps us think about and conceptualize social psychology and the position of the individual in society. But I'm really not confident yet that we know enough to have an intentional impact that we know 100% that we're going to help instead of harm. So just keep that in mind. So 5 years ago, we started with a really big question. How do we coordinate attitudes in societies? Because at the time that we developed this set of proposals, Cambridge Analytica was a big thing. Brexit had just happened. Trump he had either just been elected or he was in the process of being elected. And there was a real realization that attitudes are very important to society, that if people can coordinate their attitudes, then they can have a kind of social power. You can decide whom to elect. You can undermine your opposition. And of course, you possibly have these shadowy characters intervening in these really important social issues like climate change, modifying our collective values without our knowledge, producing radicalization, shifting health beliefs. And so there was a real realization that this is something we need to understand. And in our group, our aim is to try and develop a coherent social identity framework for understanding attitudes, from the micro level basic psychology all the way up to macro level social effects. So in that sense, I think what we're doing is somewhat unusual, because we're trying to identify really basic psychological processes and then trace them through layers of analysis or levels of analysis. So if that micro process exists, then what effect would we expect it to have at a macro level if we're looking at sort of computational or digital traces like on social media? So our micro level question is, does agreement create threads of affinity between individuals? And then I'm moving to the macro level. We're asking, do these threads form higher level social fabric? Do they link people into opinion groups? And can this help us understand opinion synchronization in society? So let's start then with the micro process. And to explain this, I'm going to be going through some quite boring features of the experiments that we ran to give you a sense of how basic these processes are. So diving right in, people who know social psychology or a little bit about the history of social psychology might be familiar with the minimal groups experiments, originally run by Tajfel and colleagues. And those experiments very simply put people into completely arbitrary groups, like essentially giving people a color to represent their group, or a preference for an artist, some very minimal categorization. And these people had no prior relationship with each other, no history, and no expectation that they would have any kind of shared identity going forward. They were just in an experiment. They were given a category that they shared with other people. And these early experiments showed that people very quickly develop identification with that category and the other people that belong to their group. So if you tell people, hey, you guys are in the yellow group, then after a little bit of time, people favor the yellow group. They engage in in-group bias against the other groups, like let's say there's a blue group. And this is a very one of the few very replicable effects in social psychology. It stood the test of time. So we took this basic paradigm, and we said, and this is particularly the work, I should say, of Kiva O'Reilly, who's just graduating with her PhD on the back of this. We said, what if we create minimal groups where people are collected together by an attitude rather than an arbitrary characteristic like a color? And what if we compare these attitude-based minimal groups to these more arbitrary groups, like based on colors? Would we get more? Would we get stronger group processes? Would people identify more with a group based on opinions or attitudes compared to a group based on some completely arbitrary criterion? So we couldn't use pre-existing attitudes to start with, because we felt, something like, I don't know, climate change or attitudes to migration, people will have potentially quite strong ideas on that going into the study, and they'll have pre-existing ideas of who the in-group and the out-group are. So to strip all of that away, to take all those confounds out, we first had to invent a whole bunch of completely, we call them novel attitudes, statements that you could agree with or disagree with, but you're unlikely to ever have heard before. So we ended up with a bunch of really funny sounding things like a circle is a noble shape. And we found through pilot studies that these are statements that we selected a bunch of these statements where there's generally a spread of opinion between disagree and agree. So I had thought it would be quite fun to ask the audience, could you put your virtual hand up if you agree that a circle is a noble shape? I think people aren't going to have time to click the button on their screen. I see a few people. So we have a small subgroup here, 6 people so far, who agree that a circle is a noble shape. We have a bunch of people who disagree. And then, of course, there are people who are still chewing their sandwich and they couldn't get to the hand up button quickly enough. But now if we put you in 2 groups, the agreeers who think that circles are noble and the disagreeers who think that they're not, we would be able to use that as the basis for a minimal group identification. So this is exactly what we did. People participated online in small groups, and we presented them with one of these novel attitude statements. If they agreed, they were in the yellow group. If they disagreed, they were in the blue group. Now, here's the critical difference between the control group and the experimental group. The control condition went through that process, but believed they were allocated to the yellow group or the blue group randomly. The experimental condition correctly believed that they're allocated to groups based on congruence and agreement. We then measured and compared identification to the yellow or the blue group. Now, remember, the only difference between these conditions is that the one realizes that they have been allocated to the groups based on their opinions. The other believes that they're in a completely arbitrary category. So 2 large pre-registered studies. In study 1, attitude congruence fostered stronger identity than minimal groups, as we predicted. And in study 2, attitude congruence fostered stronger identification than non-attitude congruence. So essentially from this, we have some evidence to make the claim that people identify more with an arbitrary group based on mutual agreement than one based on arbitrary characteristics, and that congruent attitudes can be self-categorization cues informing identification and influencing attitude polarization, especially online. So we have the basis here. We have a micro psychological process, this very basic effect that when you know that someone shares an opinion, you feel an affinity with them and you feel identification with this kind of imaginary group of people who share the same opinion. We now have some basis for thinking, well, this might happen online when you see a tweet what is it now, an X, when you see something posted on Facebook, you might have some sense of affinity with the other people who agree with that thing or who share an opinion. But of course, one of the big problems with that research is we used these really funny sounding, arbitrary, novel opinions. And it could be that those opinions are things that people feel identification with simply because they're so weird. So we had to shift this into the realm of real opinions. So we used the same basic method. We presented people with a statement which they could agree or disagree with. In this case now, we're moving to real statements which people would be expected to have some kind of opinion on from real life. But the rest of it is the same. The experimental condition correctly believed that they're allocated to groups based on their congruence and agreement. The control condition believed that they're allocated due to congruence in non-attitude information. And then we measure and compare their identification to the blue group or the yellow group. Again, we pre-registered the experiment. And in a relatively large sample, we found, as predicted, that experiencing agreement on attitudes in an otherwise anonymous context fosters in-group and opinion-based identification. So we now know that people experience a kind of affinity for others who share their novel attitudes that they've never had any attachment to before. We know that this also works with real attitudes. When you find out that someone shares your opinion on let's call it a real attitude that's out there in the world, you also have a sense of affinity to them or a sense of identification with this opinion-based group. But we needed to push it further to think about, well, what happens when you have multiple attitudes? So if you agree on more than one thing, do you have more of a sense of identification with the people? So once again, we used real opinions, in this case, opinions about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We repeated it 3 times, but the core of the study, this little bit in the middle, where the experimental condition, observe other participants' real answers, and they know that they're being allocated to a group based on their opinions. The control condition, observe other people's answers on arbitrary questions, so they have no basis for knowing whether they agree with these people or not. And then we assess identification in terms of, we assess whether identification is related to the extent to which they agreed with each other on this number of real opinions. So once again, it was pre-registered, and we had several reasonably large samples, and the findings replicated across all 3 studies, where cumulative attitude congruence strengthens identification. So the more attitudes you agree on, the more you are likely to identify with the other people in your opinion group. And I don't have time to show you these results in any detail, but in-groups can strategically align their attitudes. So when people are getting feedback about the opinions of their partners in this kind of online situation, they're able to tailor their answers so that the group agrees more than they would by chance. So in other words, people are quite sensitive to how their expressions of their opinions are positioning themselves in a social space. So this is just a visual depiction of those results. We have identification on the y-axis. We have how many opinions did they agree on. And so this is study 1. They answered questions on 3 opinions. And we can see in the experimental group where they could see the answers of their partners and they knew that they either agreed or disagreed. We find a much bigger concentration up in the top right, which means that there's much more identification. And the control group had a much flatter line. So that's quite strong support for our hypotheses. In study 3, they answered these questions sequentially across 12 time points, and we can see again there's much more density in the top right corner than the bottom left, which tells us in the experimental group, the more they agreed sequentially, the more they identified with each other. So these results provided really strong support for the pre-registered hypothesis that the higher the attitude congruence on these real attitudes, the higher identification people share with other members of their group. So a summary so far, in many ways, this is very obvious, right? I mean, a lot of people, when they hear these studies, would say, well, surely isn't that what we would expect? You know, why is this surprising? And I agree actually that this is what you would expect. But weirdly, in the, I would say, 60 or 70 odd years since the social identity theory was developed and the minimal group paradigm was invented, to our knowledge, no one has actually explored this empirically. So this was the first step-by-step empirical test of that chain of logic, that when people agree with each other, they tend to identify with each other. The more things they agree on, the more they identify. And so this is like really solid step-by-step evidence, I think, that shared opinions can form a hub for identification. Now, of course, it's not the only thing that can that can be a kind of core for identification. There are loads of other things that we can use as kind of symbols of belonging. But what we've shown here is that opinions are one of them, that agreement on opinions can be a badge of belonging to a group. And that there is this kind of dose-response effect, that the more things you agree on, the more likely you are to feel like a group member. There might be a limit. We haven't done the studies to find it yet. So just to summarize where we are, we have attitudes, we have people, and then the people agree with the attitudes, and as a result, they feel some kind of identification or affinity with the people that they're interacting with. Conversely, and I think this has got some really solid evidence in qualitative and qualitative work, especially in conversation analysis, disagreement is really a cue for disaffiliation. So agreement breeds identification and affinity. Disagreement breeds disidentification. So now, building up from that, what we're going to do next is we are going to increase the number of attitudes, and we did that in some of those studies, and increase the number of people. And you can see that what we're starting to get here is a network where the people agree with attitudes, and as a result, you can see these kind of virtual links between the people and virtual links between the attitudes. The virtual links between the people are predicated on joint agreement with one or more attitudes. The virtual links between the attitudes are on the basis that one or more people jointly hold those two attitudes. So you can see that attitudes and people might form a kind of social complex, and we're referring to that complex as an identity space, which is comprised of people holding opinions. So to move from here to the next part of our research, a little bit of terminology. Most people are familiar with this already. So a network is or a graph, if you want to use the mathematical term for it, is a structure made up of nodes. A node is any kind of entity that you could represent as a circle on a page, I guess. And then those nodes are connected by edges. An edge would represent any kind of relationship between the entities. So this is like an incredibly flexible way of modeling a structure of any kind. In this case, we are modeling attitudes as nodes. Well, actually, I'll get to that in a minute. We are using a special case of network where we actually have two types of nodes. So we've got people, and we've got attitudes. Here I've used an example of a co-author analysis because this is a form of bipartite network that people are very familiar with. You've got papers, you've got authors, and an author is linked to a paper if they are a co-author on that paper. So that's very obvious. And these two authors are linked because they were both authors on paper A. These two authors, 3 and 4, are linked because they were both authors on paper B. Now we have a kind of virtual relationship between author 1 and author 4. Why? Because author 2 was a co-author on both paper A and B. So we can see that there's potentially a bridge between author 1 and author 4 via author 2. So we're going to do a similar thing here with attitudes and people. So we have people on one layer, and we have attitudes on another layer. And the people are holding attitudes. And if two people hold the same attitude, they're going to be linked together with this kind of higher order, let's call it a virtual link. And if two attitudes are held by the same person, then they link together by this kind of higher order virtual link. So to simplify things, we're going to call the people layer, we're going to call that the agent layer. And the symbolic layer consisting of the attitudes, we're going to call that the symbolic layer. Okay. So hopefully everyone's keeping up with that little bit of theory, but if we take the symbolic layer and think about an opinion survey, then what do the nodes represent? The nodes are attitudes, and the links between the nodes, let's take this purple one and this brown one, the links between the nodes exist when individuals in that survey hold both of those attitudes together. So in this representation, the clusters represent people who have given similar answers. So we can say they're like answered. The edges represent similarities in responses. And each person represented by a little circle is positioned in the network depending on A, the combination of attitudes that they expressed, B, in relation to the combination of attitudes expressed by each other agent. So you can see that this system is dynamic, it can change over time, but it's properly relational. The position of each person depends on the answers that each other person gave. So if we take that very basic principle and we apply it to a political survey, and I should be clear, it's not obvious immediately, but surveys are actually naturally in this format. You have a list of people, you have a list of their attitudes to a set of their answers to a set of attitudes, and that's essentially describing the bipartite network with almost no processing required. To get from the bipartite network to a projection of it, either looking at the agents or the attitudes, needs a little bit of mathematical work, which we now have an R and Python package to help you do that. But at its core, these things are naturally, a survey is naturally a bipartite network. So if we take the American National Election Studies, which is a very commonly used survey in political science for people looking at polarization, and we take self-reported political affiliation, whether someone self-identifies as a Republican or a Democrat, a bit of technical information, we resampled to account for different sample size, and then we run this technique to map group structure from homophily on their core attitudes like abortion and gun control. This is what we get. So the red dots are Republicans, the blue dots are Democrats, and here we have the network for 2012. And you can see that in 2012, on this particular set of attitudes, there's not a lot of polarization. Certainly we can't pick it up visually. We can see that the blue dots are sort of, they tend to have higher density on the one side of the plot, and the red ones tend to have higher density on the other side, but we can't really describe that as polarized. By 2016, we're seeing visually that polarization is emerging. And by 2020, it's really obvious. You really don't have to remove a lot of links in this network to completely separate the bulk of the Democrats from the bulk of the Republicans. So before I go on, I need to introduce a little network metric called the cut size. And basically, if we have a network with two sides to it, the cut size simply measures how many edges would we have to take away before we have two completely disconnected groups. So a low cut size means that we only have to snip a few threads. A high cut size means that we'd have a lot of snipping to do before we could get two disjointed groups. We're going to use two other metrics as well. The path length, which is just what's the longest, or on average, how many steps does it take to get from each node to each other node? And of course, a lower path length means this should actually be tighter connection. But the lower the path length, the more tightly the network is connected. So running those metrics on the networks that we generated from the ANES, we can see that the average cut size is falling year on year, and the drop from 2012 to 2016 is a bit. The drop from 2016 to 2020 is quite substantial. What that means is, like, in this kind of social fabric of agreement, by 2020, you really don't have to cut a lot of threads in that opinion space to completely separate the Democrats from the Republicans. And we get similar kinds of results with path length as well. So the blue are Democrats, the red are Republicans, and we can see in that should be not 2036 and 2044. It should be the same years as the other years. So I think it's 2012. We don't have much of a difference. 2016, it increases quite a lot. And 2020, it's increased again. So the Republican average path length is increasing. The Democrat average path length is decreasing. What that means is the Democrats are getting more cohesive, interconnected attitudes. The Republicans are actually spreading all over the place. So what does this mean for our theory, our social identity theory of opinions, and how do these things map into a larger framework for thinking about identity and social life? Well, the way we're thinking about it is that each group has a range of normative opinions. So if any Democrat expressed any one of these opinions that I've circled, it would be completely unsurprising. And in fact, we think that if you mentioned one of those attitudes, people would assume that you are a Democrat, because that's what Democrats think and that's what Democrats say. How do we know that? Because this is a very, very common response for a Democrat. Similarly, for Republicans. So we think that these attitude sets become more identity laden as the system polarizes. So the attitudes aren't naturally identity laden. They become identity laden through social interaction and activity. Once identity is kind of woven into this system, then people can differentiate each other based on their responses to these items. But critically, group members can hold different opinions so long as cohesion is maintained in the social fabric. So there's a range of things that you can say, a range of combination of opinions that you can hold and still be a good Democrat. But once you stray out of that space, then probably you need to start accounting for yourself and you don't look like a normal Democrat or Republican anymore. How are individuals located in that space? Well, it's through what they say and how they behave. As a result, people can shift position if they change their attitudes. Or, and this is where it starts to become a bit different to other models, people could stick with their own attitudes. They give the exact same answers in 2012 and 2020, but the whole system can reconfigure around them. So they're like a rock in a river and the water is flowing past them. As a result, the attitudes they expressed in 2012 that positioned them as a Democrat now position them somewhere else. Maybe that they're now in Republican space. And you can imagine this happens to people as they age. They don't update their attitudes, the world changes around them, and suddenly the things that used to position them as liberal now position them as conservative, and it's just really confusing for them. So this links really neatly back into the original work in social identity theory, that the original authors, Turner, Oakes, and others, argued that the activity of individuals collectively creates a social field in which each individual is uniquely positioned by their actions and characteristics. So here what we've got is a method that can capture the dynamical social field in some way of how identity is produced in an opinion by opinions to I'm tying myself up here, but basically how opinions are used by people to create an identity space. So what we're doing is we're saying opinions aren't really that meaningful if we think of them as contents of people's heads. Actually, what we need to be doing is thinking of them as expressions that are socially performative. The important thing about attitudes is that they tell people who we are, what groups we belong to, and what they should think of us. But crucially, that only works in a system that's identity-laden already. And how does the system become identity-laden? It's through the collective activities of the people within it. So attitude expressions position us in collective identities and simultaneously dynamically define those identities. So this is what Turner and Oakes would have called an interactionist social identity system. And a key question now is, can people read identity in this space? So we tested this because this is a key part of our thesis, that when people express an opinion that exists in one of these tightly structured opinion systems, that other people would be able to read it in identity terms. So we took the ANES survey that we knew had this kind of tight social structure, and we gave participants, we recruited people online. They were Americans, they were either Democrats or Republicans, and we gave them statements from the survey, and we said something like, abortion should be illegal, fully disagree. And we said to our participants, can you guess what political orientation that person is? So I think in this case, it's very obvious that person is probably a Republican. So were our participants able to position people? And the answer is yes, they could. The correlation is like obscenely high. And if this wasn't pre-registered with the data online, I would actually be worried that people would think that this is fraudulent research, because without making up your data, you really wouldn't expect to get a correlation that high. So what this says is that in a tightly structured opinion space, people are very good at guessing someone's identity from the opinion they express. And obviously that means that it becomes difficult to express an attitude that strays out of your group's territory. In a way, it becomes difficult to express ambivalence or uncertainty in a tightly structured opinion space. So our big picture argument from this series of studies is, first, that attitude expressions produce a social field and position people within it, that social polarization exists when you have an opinion system where attitudes reliably distinguish different group identities. And the interface between the social and the psychological is the ability for people to position themselves and each other in groups by the attitudes they express. And of course, the more that people need to position each other in group terms, the more structured the belief network comes and the more group-loaded the attitude becomes. So you can imagine when threat gets ramped up, or when there's a war, or when there's a national crisis like migration, or when you can convince someone or a group of people that there's a crisis, then this whole social process gets ramped up. Now, this has some really tricky consequences if it's true. So this is a study that that was primarily led by Dino Carpentras, who was a Marie-Curie fellow with our group. And we modeled an opinion system based on people's responses to vaccine opinions from the Wellcome Trust Global Survey. And we found that there is such strong agreement amongst, let's call them the moral majority, and that the majority of people in society are positioned in this strong trust area of the opinion space. What it means is that anyone who expresses any doubts at all is a long way from the moral majority, and unfortunately really close to what we might call vaccine hesitant people, or if you're a bit more extreme, you might call them anti-vaxxers. And what Dino found is that over time, the people with any kind of doubt or ambivalence were drawn over time towards the side that they were closest to. So I don't know what to do with this finding, because we can't really say, oh, we need to express more doubt in vaccination. But actually, somehow we need to bridge this gap between people with a little bit of ambivalence, a little bit of doubt, some kind of valid criticisms of scientific method, for example, would fall there. How do we bridge that gap between people? And honestly, I don't know. And I'm really anxious about presenting this as a finding that should have some impact, because the risk is really, there's a really clear danger that we could have the opposite effect. And then one last conclusion before I end. Polarization is particularly likely when attitudes to key issues align on identity lines. So in political science, they call this partisan sorting. But here's a really lovely illustration of it from Dairy Girls. And the famous blackboard, which is now in a museum somewhere, and all these differences between Protestants and Catholics in the highly politicized Northern Irish context. For example, Protestants keep their toasters in cupboards. What does that mean? It means once you know where someone keeps their toaster, you can make a really good guess at what that person's political identity is. This would only work in a really constrained social context where the identity space has become highly systematized over time through social interaction in a really threatened and politically charged environment. If you're in, I don't know, France, and you find out where someone keeps your toaster, it tells you nothing at all about their political identity. So this shows that the opinion identity dynamics are located within a particular time and a particular space. And I think that's a good place to end it. Just to alert people that we've got an R package under development. It's almost ready to go. So you can get access to that at surveygraph.ie. And if you want to screenshot this page, there are links to some of our key publications that I've presented here. So once again, thank you to my collaborators who did all the hard work. And that's it.
Thanks a million, Mike. That was a brilliant talk. Really, really interesting. Very complex, and you've done a brilliant job of making it accessible. So thank you very much.